and welcome to the latest episode of It's Not Just Hot Air, the podcast from the Pilot Group. Today we're going to be talking about the good, the bad and the ugly. And I will clarify what I mean by that. So we're going to be talking about real life scenarios that Pilot Group have bumped into in terms of helping companies reduce their carbon footprint and their gas consumption costs with their energy management system. So before we jump into that, I'm here with Phoebe and Odessa from the Pilot Group. Welcome. Would you both like to introduce yourselves before we get started?
Go ahead.
So polite.
Thank you. I'm Phoebe. I'm one of the account managers for the sales team. So looking after new business, existing business out on the road, seeing all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
In the coalface, so to speak.
Yes, in the cold light of day.
All corny jokes aside.
And I'm Odessa. I'm also account manager at Pilot Group. So also, along with Phoebe, visiting sites, seeing our clients, reducing gas where we can.
Mm-hmm. So as being on the front line, as we said, you must get to see some interesting, as we say, good, bad and ugly situations. So let's start with the juicy stuff first about some horror stories. Obviously, we're not going to name the innocent or the guilty. But what are some really great examples of inefficiencies that you've bumped into on the way?
Where to start? One that really sticks out to me is actually a book manufacturer. So they put a book and bind a book together, everything bar the hard face copy of the book. It was a site down south actually, and it was actually just the way that the heating was set up to begin with. They had a set of radiant tubes across the production area, some obviously in quite opportune places for where the machines were, which is a great way of actually heating a space. It was quite efficient because they don't need to heat the full building. But where some of the radiant tubes, I was actually really surprised, not just from an energy perspective, but also from a health and safety perspective as well, really, in the grand, where radiant tubes were actually situated over racking. They were still very much working, but what was actually on the racking was sets of books.
So paper.
Yeah.
something a little flammable.
Yeah, just a tad. Probably I would say there's the distance between there, but when we were actually looking around, they were still very much operational and set to the times of the production area were. So I'm not quite sure how the building is still standing, considering it's been like that for a good 5 years. But just a massive way of inefficiency for respect of actually having heaters where it's not actually heating any kind of workforce on the ground. And specifically with radiant tubes, it's designed for spot heating. It's not designed to heat a full area. It's designed just to heat the workforce in the area that they are. So the fact that they had radiant tubes above racking, which is not heating anyone, actually just heating the paper and the pigeons probably, was
and
highly
almost setting everything on fire. So which would I guess heat a larger area.
Well, yeah, you could say that.
So what was their reaction then when you sort of pointed all this out? Were they quite open to that? Were they surprised?
So because we were sort of called in at group level, the people that we were dealing with on site were just sort of local site managers in some respects. So it wasn't necessary. I think he was aware of it more than anything. Tried to almost brush me off in some respects when I sort of highlighted it even further. And actually almost tried to sort of reassure me that the gas had been capped off, but as part of, because we already had an existing control system on site and we were looking at upgrading it, we make sure that we're actually testing all the equipment that's already in the building as well. So when I'd run all tests to fire up the heaters, they were very much on. So reporting that back to sort of the FD and the MD, yes, they were very concerned, and I don't think they were quite aware of what was actually going on. I was like, please don't shoot the messenger.
It wasn't me.
Yeah.
I think it's No,
go ahead.
I think it's a really common problem though, because when the original buildings are created and the heating is put in, then the area changes needs or requirements.
Yeah.
So the original build and the original design no longer fits. So one that I went to last week was that they had these huge heaters everywhere, but then they built a mezzanine. So now they have this mezzanine that is covered, essentially a third of it is covered by this huge heater that is really not required to heat the space anymore, but it used to be required because that wasn't there. But then it's nobody's role or responsibility to change that. They just need to make the space suitable for production. And then it feels almost like a finger point exercise, which it never is. It just comes across like, oh, you've got this fire hazard, and everyone's like, oh, who do we blame for this? And it's not about that. It's just about let's fix this and then control it. But
because it sounds really obvious when you say it like we're saying it here, and it's very easy to sort of do that, isn't it? To think, oh, well, why would you do that? But like we've said before, it's probably not the people who are working there now that are responsible for where the heaters were, or even maybe how it's set up now.
No, they're just almost being passed on a problem.
Yeah, and just you don't even register it if it's not your full-time job, I suppose, to think about it. So what's surprised you? So I would imagine probably with the larger companies that you deal with as well, where if you're dealing centrally with HQ, for example, and you're being told, right, okay, I now need you to go around the sites and see what's happening, and you're probably told one thing, and then when you get out on the sites, perhaps it's not quite as everybody imagined. Have you got some interesting stories there?
Yeah, so we'd done a couple of surveys for an electrical component wholesaler, which had about 10 to 16 sites across the UK. A slightly legacy client as well, had an old controller on site, which he thought was working perfectly at group level in terms of all the times were set. It was just a case of actually just upgrading the technology because we could benchmark what the technology was to what we've got now and improve it from an additional savings perspective. And that type of control system that was on site doesn't have remote access. It's got a system going back to sort of the 90s, really. Would have been very impressed if it did, but and he was under the impression that it was set to what the branch opening times were. When we'd actually got to site, we'd noticed that it was on 24 hours at 16 degrees.
Oh my gosh.
And when we sort of just decided to sort of question it with the site managers, the local site managers that were at each branch, it was like, well, why is this the case? And he was like, well, it's for an energy saving perspective. It's like, what's the logic behind that? It was like, well, if you're keeping it at a constant temperature all the time, it's not having to ramp up and ramp down, and we get extra savings from it. I was like, that is an old wives' tale. I was like, there's no way. So yeah, reporting that back to someone at the group level, he was absolutely, and it's before sort of he had AMR reads on his gas meters and things like that. So he was only seeing the gas bill, which was for the month prior, and it gave him no real granular detail of when that gas was being consumed. So in terms of him acting on it, how long that was the case, I do not know.
Yeah. But I suppose the bills were consistent with previous bills, so it wouldn't necessarily flag as an exception, would it? You'd just think, well, that's how much it costs to heat those locations.
And again, it almost goes back to changing personnel as well. If that change has been made before that person at group levels come into play, he's never really going to be able to spot the difference, even if there's 10 years that's gone by in that respect. So yeah, that was a bit of a tough one whilst we were trying to survey group level. But I also think it goes back to how we position it as a business as well. A little bit like what Odessa said, it's not exactly like a finger pointing exercise. What we're trying to do is really just highlight the inefficiencies to almost come up with a solution and a resolution pretty much straight off the back of how we can improve things.
Yeah, and definitely with some quick wins, because it's like being at home, isn't it? I mean, you say about that old wives' tale about constantly. I remember hearing that when I was growing up, like, oh, if you keep the heating on the same temperature, it doesn't have to catch up, and it's probably put about by the gas companies, I would imagine. It's like, this is how you're meant to use it. But it's interesting, isn't it? So if you run into scenarios where that's not where there aren't so obvious things like that, where perhaps the company feels like they've got control over it, they've got the basics covered, they've got people doing best practice for all of this stuff, have you found that there are still surprises for them in terms of where they can make savings?
Yeah. I mean, one springs to mind pretty well, actually. A large logistic firm who were sort of UK-wide sites all together across the UK. Before we did the surveys last year, we already had sort of 38 sites on the old controllers. But we were tasked with surveying another 12 depots across that didn't have control systems in place, but they'd sort of replicated the same sort of behavioural change that they'd seen with the controls that we installed maybe 6-7 years ago. So in terms of making sure times were set when doors weren't open and things like that, because a depot to them has got sort of a long radiant tube system set up with 37 doors across the depot, so on all doors are open at the exact same time. Turns out that wasn't very much the case. Even though they thought they had it well controlled, it wasn't actually the case. The heating was still very much blaring away when the doors are open. The target temperatures that they'd sort of instructed from a heating engineer perspective weren't being followed. They were trying to do that standardization process even without the controls, and that wasn't the case. So we did a test case with 3 depots last year to see, and we'd sort of benchmark what we could already improve, and we knew the technology was going to make a saving anyway. And we also factored in the door sensor function as well, and we'd seen an 83% reduction at one site, an 87% reduction.
Holy moly.
And then a 67% reduction. So even when they thought they had it very, very well controlled, there was still quite a lot of room to make some savings.
Gosh, I bet they were really surprised by that, weren't they?
Yeah. And even from an upgrade perspective as well, we've seen some great savings on the old controller too, which surprised me, to be honest, because I was being a little bit conservative around the savings that we could save because we knew they already had some form of controls in place, but we'd still smashed what we'd actually promised to save them. I think at one site we'd promised her a 15% saving, and we'd made a 43% saving on top of our own controls. So.
Yeah, wow.
I think a lot of that comes from as well when people see a control system already installed, they almost inherit that from legacy people that have worked in that role previously, or just it was installed as it was installed X amount of years ago and then left, and then the areas that people are working in have changed, or the times or shift patterns have changed, and I think sustainability and looking after that kind of side of the business is still very new roles in a lot of companies, so no one's really been monitoring it. So then it comes to a point where we say, okay, let's upgrade the system, it's older technology, these are the new things. They actually benefit from the legacy scheduling just by updating their scheduling on the system, because
just from that one piece they can get a lot of savings without all the bells and whistles. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess, well, I think we're all guilty of it, aren't we? You inherit a heating system because you do it at home, don't you? You don't even think about it. You think, well, if it works, that's your primary concern, is it's not broken down and it's working.
Yeah, it's true. And I think a little bit like what Odessa was saying, it can be that configuration change without even actually upgrading the technology. I've done it at home, not this year because I've not put the heating on this year.
Blimey, you're good. I live down south, I've already put mine on.
Well, mine's been on for weeks.
We were having this conversation earlier.
That's why you've got a jumper on.
Yeah, that's why you're in a vest. Residual heat from being at home.
We're still basking in it now.
But no, I did it at home before the energy crisis, the way that it went. My thermostat was set to like 21 degrees. And it isn't until working in this job, I mean, I should have known this prior to that, but, for every degree that you're reducing your target temperature down by, you're actually equating to about a 6% saving on your annual spend. So us factoring that into what we're doing in terms of the configuration element and doing that handover with the operations team to make sure that it's configured right at installation. Going back to the logistics company, they had a target temperature of 19 degrees. And we were actually saying, really, do you need that? Because you've not got operatives in that area all the time. And if they are, it's a handful of people. And your radiant tubes are positioned fairly well that because they're fairly low, they're still going to get quite oh God, I can't even think of the word. Is it a density of heat? Would that be the right word to say? Strong level of heat. Let's go with that.
Yeah, I think density is a good word,
So we were like, let's set it at 16 degrees see how we go. If we start to get complaints, we'll up it by 0.5 degree at a time. But we'll do that without the staff knowing, working in that area. No issues whatsoever.
Nobody said anything.
Yes, that's an instant saving of what, maybe 18% already off an annual spend just by reducing the temperature down. And that's exactly what I did at home. I set my thermostat to 17 degrees just to see what the difference was compared to last year, and I've not turned it up. It stayed at that temperature.
Isn't that interesting? And it's funny, isn't it? Because I guess that's where we all get our experience with thermostat controls is at home. Whereas you think that bears no relation to a giant warehouse. but I guess, like you said earlier, these people aren't specialists like you guys are. They just sort of, they go with what they know and what they're used to. And it's like, oh, well, I have it at 19 at home, so I'll do that here because I know that's comfortable.
Yeah.
I think it's the same. Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
I think it's the same with setting a temperature for when you want the temperature. So, for instance, at home, we start learning with that on the older boilers with those stupid dials where you like slide them across to work out what time you want the heating to come on. You're like, okay, I need it warm by 7. So if I just whack it on at 5, 5:30, it'll be there around about by 7.
Yeah.
And then they're just old habits you've learned. And then all of a sudden someone says, oh, well, you manage this in the factory, and you're like, oh yeah, the shift starts at 7. I'll wham the heat on at 5.
The same knowledge,
see what happens. But actually, there's technology now that will tell you what time it should be coming on instead of the guessing game. And again, if you save a few degrees, a few hours here and there, that percentage saving is just going to be so much.
Well, at that scale, it's going to be massive, isn't it? And it's switching it off too, isn't it? Because I remember reading about the technology about using residual heat, so it turns off actually before it hits the target temperature. Yeah. Because the residual heat will get it to where it needs to be. Yeah. And that must make quite significant savings for people.
Yeah, massively so. When we come to look at a guaranteed saving for a client, we'll sort of break it down in small percentages in terms of the different control strategies that we offer of how we can make up to that guaranteed saving. And the biggest bulk of the saving comes from the residual heat function. To be honest, though, in terms of the technology, it is very, very clever. But what we're actually doing is just being a little bit smarter. You know, what you would have with a normal heater without our control system on is that it would run the fan down as it normally does. But once it's reached target temperature, what we're doing is running the fan down before it's reached target temperature, knowing that the residual heat in the unit will get you up to that extra 1 degree to reach that target temperature. So it's like a small win. And it's quite simple when you think about it, but it goes a long way to actually contributing to at least probably 15% of the saving of the guaranteed 25, I would say.
Well, yeah, because you imagine that over 50 heaters in one location, for example, that's quite significant, isn't it?
Yeah, and as well, it's I think I always describe this. We've got sort of what we call as like an end time optimization program, where we'll turn the heaters down by 0.5 degree. An hour before the shift ends and half an hour again before the shift ends. We're not doing anything too clever with that. Actually, if anything, it's more of a psychological factor. Really.
Yeah, because they think, but it's often the simplest solutions are the most effective, aren't they? I think that's very true in life. Well, thank you. That's been interesting. It's always good to hear some war stories. So everyone listening, turn your heating at home down a couple of degrees and see if you can put up with it. And you never know. You're going to save, 6% did you think on your gas bill? So
and don't leave it on all the time.
No, because that's an old wives' tale. I have to say, that is something I've learned today. I mean, I've not thought about that for years, but yeah, that was definitely news to me. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today, and we look forward to having you join us again next time. But for now, it's time to close the shutter on another great episode of the Not Just Hot Air podcast.